So to start us on our arc through the rest of this justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion anchoring session, it's my absolute pleasure to be introducing Jacqui Patterson. Jacqui is the director of the NAACP Environmental and Climate Justice Program. She's a member of the ASAP Board of Directors. And since 2007, Jacqui has served as a coordinator and co-founder of Women of Color United. Jacqui has an incredibly long bio, which spans just work from the US to the international, where she served as a researcher, a program manager, an advocate, and a leader in the environmental injustice movement. And I am so happy to have Jacqui be a part of the circle of people that I'm having an opportunity to learn from and to be part of our ASAP network so that we can all be learning together along with her. In this session, just so you know, as our meeting norm, if you would like to keep your camera off during Jacqui's remarks, that would be fine. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jacqui to talk to us about the intersection of justice, equity, and climate change adaptation.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you all today, and definitely looking forward to having this series of conversations with you. And thank you to Beth for your leadership, for your heart for this work, and for such a great grounding and framing for our conversations today. So when we look at climate adaptation through an equity and justice lens, we know that there's so many kind of components to equity and justice, from in terms of people and populations. It relates to geography, to country of origin, to gender, faith, ableism, gender identity and sexual orientation, income, wealth, and so many other factors that immigration status as well. So many other factors that kind of impact the extent to which one is experiencing equity and justice in this landscape. Because of as a racial justice organization, the work that we do intersects with all of those factors. But in the minutes that I have to talk with you, I'm going to focus in on race, and then there'll be some intersectional components there. But I just want to make sure we acknowledge that justice, equity, diversity, inclusion is more than race and intersectional with race. So when we talk about climate adaptation and resilience, we first, I guess, kind of to define resilience in the first place, we see it as like this complex set of intersectional, individual, familial, community, and societal factors and systems that intersect with social and economic and political constructs. So that's just an important kind of grounding as we think about all the different systems that impact the extent to which we are adapting to climate change and rooting justice and equity in our adaptation practices. So in the United States, it means that who you are and where you live matter to one's relationship with each and every one of these various systems and factors. For African Americans, like the historic social, political, and economic disenfranchisement has been detrimental to our generational resilience, while culture, brilliance, and sheer survivalist grit have been protective factors. So that's one thing to start with as well, that often these attributes, whether it's race or all the different things that I named before, are often named as vulnerabilities. We know that because of society does wield them as factors for marginalization, but that's because that's a societal learned practice and systematized practice. But we can't allow ourselves to get mired in this notion that like I was speaking to someone once who is a very well, a friend actually, and someone who is who's very well intended and a great leader in this movement. And she said to me while we were talking, we were talking about race and so forth. And she said something like, just because I was fortunate enough to be born white. And I was like, like I understand where you're going with that, in terms of kind of privilege and advantage. And no, definitely Definitely no. And so, but this is kind of the way that we're socialized. So even one of the more woke people that I know, like that is, that was something that came out of her mouth. And so, and that's unfortunately the socialization of our society to now consider it to be better to be white. So these are the kinds of socialized practices that we have. So it's just important to kind of remember the assets and the strengths in each of our kind of stations in society. And what we need to do is to root out those practices and systems and values that end up making certain attributes to the detriment of certain people. So just going forward, as we think about climate adaptation, we see how these various factors impact our ability to adapt to climate change in so many different ways. It's starting with the transatlantic slave trade that brought over African Americans from the continent of Africa as cargo in the hulls of ships. So right away, the devaluing, the dehumanization, the utter lack of rights, the utter lack of being regarded as human, started with people being commoditized in that practice. And as you imagine people in the hulls of ships in a place that from the very beginning wasn't meant for human habitation. So it means that many people died in that passage, and their bodies were just thrown overboard like we would throw away a piece of tissue. And that there became this whole notion that we've even seen in the COVID-19 situation, that our work was essential to what was happening in this nation as this nation was being built, but our personhood wasn't acknowledged, nor was that valued. So the work was essential, but the people were disposable. And it really struck me. It was my first trip out of my home since March. Besides going to the grocery store, which is the highlight of my week these days. But anyway, besides those few trips, my weekly trips, I actually drove to Mississippi. This would have been my mom's 80th birthday, and I decided to visit the place where she was born in Dublin, Mississippi, in this unincorporated area of Mississippi. And so I went there, and right across the street right across the highway from her community is this vast cotton field. And I thought about and I was looking at the cotton field and looking at these tractors that were harvesting the cotton, and then these huge bales of cotton that were like 15-foot circumference, kind of machine bound bales, and just thought about who was doing that work, that work that's now done by this kind of industrial operation was done by my ancestors. And just thinking about, again, that kind of notion of essential work, but non-essential people, because I thought about also the many stories that we read of people out there harvesting the cotton and actually giving birth while in the cotton field and having to continue working after giving birth. So literally just not having to finish out the day of cotton picking after you've given birth. And that kind of notion of, again, the essential work, but the non-essential people. And so today, fast forward today, we're seeing that in the context of COVID-19, where the work is essential, but the people aren't being cared for, and the system isn't accommodating a valuing of the people as much as they're valuing the work that's being done. So anyway, so from moving on from the transatlantic slave trade to the disconnection with any type of security in terms of housing security, economic security, and so forth, as people became the generational wealth of white America, while not being able to build up any wealth and security ourselves. And that leads us to where we are today in terms of these extreme income, wealth, and housing differentials, with African Americans least likely to be homeowners, with 44% of African Americans being homeowners versus 75% of white Americans. and continuing to bear the brunt of the historic and modern day redlining practices that impacts everything from where we own homes to whether we own homes and the quality of the homes and the quality of the environment in which we're situated. And we also are more likely to be homeless, with 40% of African Americans being 40% more likely to be homeless, African American families being 50% more likely to be homeless than white American families, and housing insecurity and these challenges even increase more for women-held led households. Then we also know that our homes are sited in the floodplains, more likely to be sited in floodplains. We're more likely to be exposed to in the urban heat islands. We're more likely to be sited next to toxic facilities. We're more likely to be in the context of crumbling infrastructure. More likely to have energy burden, more likely to have poor housing stock, more likely to have indoor air pollution. And all of these are compounding cumulative challenges that put us deeper and deeper into the downside of the subterranean level of being able to adapt to the impacts of climate change. So we see the impacts playing out in terms of gentrification and displacement in our communities, disaster and displacement of our communities, sea level rise and resulting displacement, whether we're displaced from our lands directly, near water, or whether it is other communities being displaced from being near the water, and then they end up in our communities, and then we get displaced from our communities as people move inland. And then we're more susceptible to the societal shocks that increase housing insecurity. So all of these are the challenges that we face. But as we think about the ways that we have to address these challenges, we recognize that just is how deeply rooted racism is in our challenges around climate change. So having a system where the trade rules, manufacturing policies, labor policies, military rule, and more are resulting in challenges around pollution regulation, worker protections, diplomacy, and democracy, all of which have us in a society where profits are preserved by a wealthy white few at the expense of environmental degradation and oppressed peoples and nations. So we know that racism is also at the center of who's impacted most and who's least responsible for climate change, from the communities that are the most vulnerable due to this myriad, social, economic, and political inequities, and thus are first to die, be injured, or lose property and be displaced by disasters and sea level rise, and whose communities are paying the price of increased food insecurity in places where it's already a challenge to find life-sustaining foods. Racism is also at the center of the procedural, distributive, and contextual inequities in how we're addressing climate change, in terms of who's at the helm of a lot of the climate adaptation processes, to who's wielding many of the adaptation resources that are out there. And even it's at the center of the many fissures in the climate movement, where restorative justice is missing and patterns of marginalization and power imbalance persist to the detriment of the entire movement. So as we think about the solutions that we need, we know that there's the false solutions, whether it's the FEMA formulas about about building back to where we were before, as opposed to building to something that's actually going to have sustained resilience and adaptation. To the adaptation field, which was so focused on infrastructure only. And it's a blessing to be with you all as we turn that tide. And the fact that you're here kind of shows your commitment to doing so. To inequitable infrastructure issues, like we know the Army Corps of Engineers uses a formula to decide where their prioritization of levees to reinforce after Hurricane Katrina, and that prioritization was based on giving points to each levee based on what the economic impact would be if it was overtaken. So those kind of formulas, as per the book Weapons of Math, M-A-T-H, and Destruction, that really talks about how these formulas are dominating our society and resulting in the deepening and fueling of inequity. So as we think about where we need to go, we know that one of the things that is particularly important and timely now is the need to get money out of politics, because we know that so much of these formulas and other types of ways that these inequities are deepened are fueled by the domination of our political system by moneyed interests who are trying to continue to concentrate wealth and power. We also know that we need to be thinking about, as we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, we need to be thinking about making sure that folks are in all spaces. The Green 2.0 reports and others have shown us that whether it's in our nonprofit organizations, in philanthropy, or in government, the folks who are most impacted by climate change are not in the decision-making spaces. So whether it's positions or of leadership and so forth, or whether and it should also be the ways that we design decision-making at the municipal and all levels, so that who's in positions is one thing, but also the processes actually are as inclusive as possible in terms of community decision-making processes, so including community advisory boards and so forth. So this means that we need to move away from practices that are harmful, like water privatization, and move towards community water board with decision-making power. It means that we're not only reinstating regulations that have been peeled back by an administration that is acting at the behest of industry, but we need to strengthen regulations. It means that policies supporting public housing are needed with strong supports for also home ownership. It means radical reform and reimagination of land use policies and increasing support for models such as community land trust. It means advancing radical models of transit equity, considering both urban areas, having no private cars, for example, radically increasing local production and reducing the shipping and trucking of goods. And it means electrification and elimination of the combustion engine. It means following in the footsteps of the great groups like the Soul Fire Farm, who's doing Black-led local food work. We, the people of Detroit, who have really taken and said we need to be in control of the water decisions of our communities. The LA Bus Riders Union, which is pushing for no private cars in LA. The People's Health Movement, Little Village Environmental Justice Organization, the Earthsea Collective, Community Land Trust, and so many more. And as we kind of wrap up, because I know our time is limited here, I just want to kind of get back to being explicit about fighting the racist systems, including facing our own individual and racist policies. So acknowledging that though the transatlantic slave trade ended 400 years ago and slavery formally ended 150 years ago, it's best to just continue on today in the policies and practices and attitudes. It's not just something that unfortunate that happens to Black folks. It's the basis for the George Floyds and the Eric Garners being brought down in the street like they're beasts, that like they're less than human. It's the very basis for the fact that average white American household wealth is $170,000, whereas the African American household wealth is $17,000, and the female-led African American household wealth is $5. It means acknowledging the fact that there's an inverse relationship between Black and white wellness, and recognize our complicity in the fact that we have a president of the United States who refuses to acknowledge white supremacy, and over 50% of the electoral college votes in this nation put him in office. And we still have 44% of the electorate that supports this type of ideology when you look at polls. And so we really are in a situation where we continue to have this perpetuation of white supremacist ideology, and to the detriment of us all. And fighting against these racist systems also means not letting the racist comment from your uncle go by just because he didn't mean it, or because he could be one of those people keeping the status quo in place. For white folks, this means joining or starting a chapter of showing up for racial justice and connecting with others to discuss and advance reparative and restorative justice. We invite everyone, of course, to join the NAACP as well, where advancing racial justice is at the heart and center of our work. And for all of us fighting against racial systems, it means embracing a new way of life for our society and systems by supporting transformative, reparative, restorative practices, such as whether it's reparations or whether it is the ways that we all build towards a common good as opposed to a singular good. And it also means that following the leadership of groups like Movement for Black Lives, showing up for racial justice, and local groups like Leaders of the Beautiful Struggle. So I just want to end by saying that this most important of all is the words of Martin Luther King, who says, in a real sense, all life is interrelated. He said that all of us are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one of us directly affects all of us indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. And you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. This is the interrelated structure of reality. So definitely looking forward to the rest of this conversations with you, and including our panel coming up in a little while. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jacqui. Thank you so much for that framing and for the honesty and for, I think, just rolling from here, right? I think right into some of what those considerations have meant in ASAP and through the JEDI leadership team. I'm going to hand it right over to Vanessa, who is going to take this conversation away about what the ASAP JEDI statement and its development has meant to that team.
I actually think Julia is starting.
Okay.
Yeah, I can kick things off. Thanks, Beth. And yeah, thank you, Jacqui, for grounding us in the importance of seeing, naming, and rooting out systemic racism and all other forms of oppression that we're seeing continue to perpetuate the injustices and ongoing inequities, and also reminding us of the importance of uplifting community-driven solutions that we're seeing kind of prop up all across the country. And of course, this is not just in this present moment, but those community-driven solutions have been paving the way for quite some time now. Hi, everyone. My name is Julia Kim. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm calling in from the traditional lands of the Ohlone peoples, which is now known as Oakland, California on the map.
I'm Galen Troyer. I prefer he, him pronouns. I'm located in South Florida, which is the ancestral lands of the Tequesta, present home of Seminole and Miccosukee.
And I'm Vanessa Lueck. My pronouns are she, her. I'm Skyping in from the lands of the Akimel O'odham and the Peepash. And right now this land is called Tempe, Arizona. And Shameika Hanson also serves on the leadership team with us. And while she's not part of this specific segment, she'll be participating in the next panel. So everyone will have a chance to meet her virtually as well.
I'm so glad that Shameika's on the panel, because she's just been a very critical part of our team and the committee overall. And we are excited to share more about that today. Before we get going, I want to thank everyone for joining us, and also invite you to reach out to me, Julia, Vanessa, if you have any questions about the committee or if you would like to get involved.
Yes, absolutely. The Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee, which you may hear us referring to it as the JEDI Committee, as it is a bit of a mouthful. We definitely welcome any and all ASAP members to join us. In fact, we definitely encourage you to, especially all of you joining for this anchoring session. I think goes to show that you are committed to this conversation, and we would certainly benefit from your involvement. So about the committee, the core purpose is to support the intentional integration of justice, equity, inclusion, and diversity into adaptation as a field, as a profession, and as an ongoing and evolving practice. We have been working to create a supportive environment for ASAP members to come together to learn, share about their own efforts, and provide mutual support. And we're also working closely with ASAP as an organization to provide guidance on how they can deepen their work in making justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion more central to ASAP's operations and programs.
And the JEDI Committee also includes two subgroups. One is focused on education and the other on accountability. The education subgroup focuses on organizing learning opportunities for the ASAP membership at large, you all, also for the JEDI Committee, and has been engaging with ASAP Strategic Planning Committee. The accountability subgroup essentially functions as a sounding board for the ASAP staff to help translate principles into concrete actions. They're currently working on translating the JEDI statement into actionable commitments.
Creating the statement was actually one of the first activities of the JEDI Committee. we felt that we needed to capture the committee's intent and the urgent need to prioritize and integrate justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion into the field. So we started working on the statement last year, and as hopefully many of you know, we finalized and published it in April, which is a big accomplishment.
I do think the statement is something that we should all be proud of, and not just the JEDI committee, and particularly the members who worked tirelessly to create, iterate, reiterate the statement to make sure we're getting it right, but really for all of us as ASAP members to be part of a network that recognizes the truly shameful reality that we're living in, and also recognizes ASAP's role in making JEDI absolutely central to all things adaptation.
Muted myself. It really is a powerful statement. I think it might be worth reading the full thing, and because I've come back to it quite a few times since April, and it's really supportive, and it grounds me in the urgency of our work. I find it a surprising statement.
I can read the statement, and I'll actually invite all of you to take a deep breath and get comfortable. If you want to either maybe close your eyes and give yourself a break from the screen while I read, or if you'd rather have that, you are more than welcome to read along because the words will come up as well. So here we go. The urgent need to equitably adapt to climate change necessitates the removal of oppressive systems and requires a transformation into a society where we all share in the power and prosperity of resilient economic and social systems. Grave injustices of the past, which have been allowed to perpetuate today, have created an unjust and inequitable society. Climate change exacerbates these inequities, as those who are the least responsible for climate change are often the most impacted. Widespread discrimination promoted by histories of colonialism, white supremacy, domination of nature, and economic exploitation have created systems that inhibit otherwise capable communities from thriving. These systems discount traditional systems of social care and ecological knowledge essential to achieving balance within the natural world. These systemic injustices pervade the realities of the climate change adaptation field and the organizations within it, including ASAP. In order to use our power to achieve the necessary transformational change, we commit to deconstructing barriers in our membership structure and engagement model to become more inclusive and accessible, expanding the adaptation conversation at ASAP. We will support all frontline communities developing adaptation resources from their lived experience and traditional knowledge, and ensure that other adaptation resources are accessible and welcoming to all communities. Further, we will lift up stories of and empower leadership from communities and critical areas of adaptation practice, which currently are poorly represented in adaptation leadership. We will not allow the actions of the past to dictate our future, and we commit to leveraging our network and resources to promote justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in the climate adaptation field and beyond.
Thanks, Vanessa. And wow, just hearing the statement again is definitely reminding me of how powerful language can be. I'm sure many of you have seen a number of statements getting released over the past year, but I really do love how this statement speaks from the heart while telling it like it is and calling out white supremacy. And it's also not a stagnant statement. It calls out specific commitments that ASAP will focus on. And in a way, it's kind of holding ASAP accountable by releasing such a public statement.
I completely agree. And I also really want to thank the committee members who worked to create this statement. We're talking about it, but we did not create this. It was a lot of work. And it's a great example of what collaboration and then welcoming in diverse perspectives can accomplish. It got better and better. And Julia and Vanessa, I'm not sure that you remember, but the process was not totally easy. There was quite a bit of tension, and what Jacqui spoke to in her presentation about tension in the need to be honest about how our work could perpetuate racist, inequitable systems, that really resonated with me. And it makes me think about back to the disagreements and the iterations in the process. I thought the JEDI committee members really embodied our values by engaging in an inclusive process that embraced that healthy tension.
I think so too. There was definitely some tension around asset-based framing and whether the statement should solely speak to racial justice or be inclusive of other forms of oppression. I was also, and I'm really glad that we came to the statement that we have now. I was also really impressed by the committee and how they faced the challenges head on and in a way that encouraged ongoing discussion before reaching consensus. And on a side note, Julie and Galen, maybe we should come up with some kind of special process in addition to the normal review for revisiting and updating the statement so that it continues to evolve as the adaptation field evolves, but also as ASAP evolves.
I think that's a great idea. The statement was created to motivate action as we individually, professionally, and collectively make progress. And we'll want to update it to highlight new opportunities and priorities, really deepen this work. I mean, fully integrating justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in adaptation will not happen overnight. And it is an ongoing practice. I think that's something that I am accepting. We'll definitely want to let the statement evolve.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I definitely love how this statement is one that is actionable and serves as a starting point. And I will say it's not even like the true starting point, because I know this is something that ASAP has been engaging in for years. I know Vanessa noted earlier how our accountability subgroup is working on developing a set of more concrete recommendations, but we're already seeing ASAP take action in the meantime. I might miss a few things. If I do, Beth or Rachel, feel free to chime in the chat. But I know that ASAP has implemented a new pay what you can model for their membership, revamped hiring processes. I mean, even the way in which this network meeting is structured, I think really shows how ASAP is working to make justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion central to its programming.
Well, and ASAP members are also proactively reaching out to the JEDI committee to bring the justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion insights to other member-led interest groups, and that is what I love to see. I feel that the tides truly are turning. For decades, the burden fell on environmental justice organizations to advocate for the prioritization of justice and equity, but now we're seeing almost a flip in this pattern where other organizations are actively looking to environmental justice organizations and community-based organizations for expertise and partnership.
And to add to that, I'm also seeing a greater focus on compensating CBOs for their time and expertise. Hopefully all of you are as well. And finally, right, I will admit that's definitely something that we at our organization haven't been getting right, but we have been working with our team to figure out how we approach this, not on just a project by project basis, but how we really embed CBO compensation and how we partner with community-led organizations as a standard operating procedure in all of our work. And I will say being part of the JEDI committee has really pushed me and empowered me to stay focused on these types of changes that really need to be made and are long overdue.
I have to admit that I was kind of surprised by how inspiring it's been to be part of this community. And given the systemic racism and thinking about the sheer amount of work and coordination that has to be done to root out oppressive practices and structures, I thought it could be demoralizing. But really, honestly, the JEDI meetings have been some of the most inspiring Zoom calls I've been on in the last 6 months. I've been on a lot of calls. And I feel supported and empowered. I feel braver about forefronting this JEDI work, in my work.
Me too. There are a lot of parallels between adaptation and equity. At their core, both are facing harsh realities, seemingly insurmountable barriers, and finding creative ways to make progress anyway. So I think it's about time that we bring these movements together.
I really believe we as adaptation practitioners are poised to advance JEDI priorities. Day in and day out, we face the wicked challenge of dealing with climate change, and it is not easy. But we find a way to stay committed and engaged through relationships and progress. I mean, I do. And I find joy working with all of you. And by focusing our attention on the real issues facing our communities, I think we can find purpose.
Yeah, Galen, I'm right there with you. I often find myself thinking about how we as adaptation practitioners we're working to create a better future, the near future of today, and then also in the longer term future of tomorrow. But what kind of future would we create if we don't make justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion central to our vision? And not only to our vision, but our journey, right? Who we engage and partner with, the decisions that we make and influence, and how we use the power and platforms that we have to advance our vision. Is this work challenging? Yes, but does it also bring joy? I would say yes to that too, wholeheartedly.
Totally, I agree. The challenging nature of our work does not mean that we don't find joy in it. And creating a strong foundation of justice, equity, diversity, inclusion in the adaptation field and profession can actually bring more joy. I think lots of joy. I actually think we could keep on going for a while because it's been a really fulfilling and fantastic process, and we're looking forward to it continuing with all of you members. And we actually originally wanted some time for Q&A. What I am going to suggest, since I see the time, is that we try and do this at the tables. When we go for lunch, that people try and, if you are able and think of it, to bring up this conversation about the JEDI statement before we move into, I'm not sure how Beth is going to do this, so I'm going to pass it over to her, but before we move into our next, to our panel and to maybe a break or not. So I'll turn it over to Beth now.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Vanessa and Galen and Julia. And just thank you to everyone who has been part of the development of the statement, the conversations that went into it. I've said this to some people. I made a commitment at the beginning of this year to find more joy in my work. And one of the places where I found that joy to be really, really profound is in bringing forward justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in ASAP, and through the development of the statement. It's been really meaningful for me, and I've really, really enjoyed working on it together with all of you. Next section. So I hope everybody was able to take a quick break, stand up, shake it out, get anything you need to get through this next hour of time that we have together. Before we dive into this session, I want to remind you that at the end of our panel, we'll be going into our networking lunch break, and you should be updating your name to either begin with a T if you'd like to go into a random room with a bunch of other ASAP members, or a B if you'd like to go into an intimate setting with a other ASAP and other ASAP member, single other member. And if you'd like to just find somebody in the room who you're excited to see if you can direct message them in a Slack channel. And we'll be sending those instructions again in the chat. So our next session is continuing our anchoring session theme on justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and putting these principles and concepts into practice. This is a panel discussion with our fellow ASAP members. We're going to be hearing from Galen Hardy, who is a community engagement specialist with the City of Ann Arbor, Kim Lundgren, who's the founder and principal of Kim Lundgren Associates, Shameika Hanson, who's a community protection specialist with the Nature Conservancy, and Milagro Henriquez, who is the founder and executive director of Mycelium Youth Network. Jacqui Patterson of NAACP is going to be moderating this next session. Jacqui, take it away.
Thank you so much. Good to be with you all once again. And yeah, I'm just honored to be working with this panel to bring this discussion with you. First of all, we're going to have each of the panelists introduce themselves. And as you know, I'm Jacqui Patterson, Senior Director of the Environmental and Climate Justice Program at the NAACP. I'm sitting on unceded Piscataway lands in ancestral territory in what's now known as Baltimore, Maryland. And so we're going to have each of the panelists share their names, their organization, their role, their sector, and how their backgrounds working on JEDI influences their individual and organizational perspectives. So I will hand it off to, let's see, sorry. I'm trying to think of, okay, well, yeah, I guess anyone who can go first. Okay, Galen, thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Galen Hardy, and I'm the Community Engagement Specialist with the Office of Sustainability and Innovations Department. Our sector would be sustainability. We're trying to move to the city to a 2030 climate neutrality goal. So what really influences me today, I spent several years organizing on the ground at Focus Hope around community safety, and ending the prison pipeline, and also organizing block clubs and things of that nature. And from there, I went on to work with Zero Waste Detroit. And there I learned, how Black communities are normally seen as those communities which represents the paths to least resistance. As a city of Detroit resident, I saw, the effects of incineration on the populace. That went on for like 30 years, with no regard to, the community's health, well-being, livelihood, nuisance odors, as well as out there, area code 48217. So today, and knowing what happens when you're not at the table, sometimes you can end up on the plate. And my goal is to make sure that we all have an opportunity. And I represent those folks who don't have a voice, those folks who've given up, those folks who can't navigate the system and the bureaucracy. So I'm here for them. And that represents everything that JEDI means. How do we get people, included, get their voices heard? So I'm not going to keep talking, but that's my introduction.
Great. Thank you so much. Lil, do you want to go next?
Hi, everybody. I'm Lil Milagro Henriquez. I am the founder and executive director of Mycelium Youth Network. We are a nonprofit that's based here in Oakland, California, or Occupy Chochenyo Ohlone land, and work directly with Black and Brown young people to be able to prepare them for climate change. And we do that through a combination of ancestral traditions and wisdom, as well as just like straight ahead STEAM teaching. All of our curriculum is NGSS aligned, it's next generation science standard aligned, and it's meant to fit effortlessly within students' schools, student science classes, and their schoolwork. So is around education. We also do a lot around like climate resilient classrooms and climate resilient schools.
Thank you. Shameika, can I go next?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Shameika Hanson. I use she, her pronouns. And I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the Wappingers peoples whose land I'm on right now in Dutchess County, New York, as well as the Taino people of the Caribbean, specifically those on the island of Jamaica, which my family is from. And then the territories of the Pamanaki, Sewanaki, also known as Long Island, which is where I work and my place of birth. And so as mentioned, I work as a community protection specialist. I work with the Nature Conservancy in New York. My background is very varied. I've done, communications work with focus on interpersonal relationships, grassroots organizing, event planning, volunteer leadership and development, as well as now focusing on equitable climate adaptation. I'm also a student at Antioch University, New England, where I'm finishing my master's, a professional science master's in environmental studies, focusing on sustainable development and climate change. And so as an first generation immigrant to this country, whose family has left one island and come to another, my adaptation work really sits at the intersection of the colonial history that we know of, that Jacqui talked about earlier, and that we continue to see play out, as Galen just mentioned, in terms of having disproportionate effects on Black people and other people of color throughout the United States. And so I come to this space with the understanding in the adaptation community that we really have the opportunity to undo and dispel some of these cyclical processes that have really brought folks to the place where they are, where the effects of climate change are exacerbating the already disproportionate issues that they face every day.
Thank you so much, Shameika. We'll have to talk about our common Jamaican roots sometime. So Kim, if you could wrap us up.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Kim Lundgren. I have my own firm now, Kim Lundgren Associates, but I have spent the last 20 years working very specifically with local governments on climate action, adaptation, mitigation, and sustainability and resilience planning and implementation. My work at this point is very much focused on helping local governments assess their opportunities, assess their vulnerabilities, work with all of their community members to make sure that we're all moving together. I think having been in the climate change arena for 20 years, one of the things I'm most happy to see about the progression in this field is the ability to really leverage climate planning to bring up all of our communities and have a strong focus on equity and justice. And so leveraging climate action planning to address chronic stressors, address discrimination, institutional racism, all of those pieces. And so having been a part of ASAP and the JEDI committee, helping put together the JEDI statement has really been incredibly uplifting and eye-opening. I've been working in this field a long time, but, I feel like it's only been the last 5 or 6 years that my clients were ready to really do proper engagement and get everybody at the table. So it's just always exciting to be a part of this group.
Thank you very much. So appreciate it. So yeah, we are going to now, get into a few topical discussions here. First, the first question we wanted to phrase is, each of you come from different backgrounds and work across different sectors. And one thing we know that is key to moving work forward is partnerships and collaborations. So how do you find partners who value justice and equity? And how do you identify those partners, and how do you maintain and cultivate and nurture those partnerships? Do you want to start, Shameika, maybe?
Sure. So, really the partners that I find come from the information and conversations that I have with the marginalized community members, right, that are most impacted in these areas. And so understanding who they trust and who they think are making meaningful impacts in their communities are very important. And quite frankly, maintaining partnerships with the people who are already making meaningful impacts in these communities are not that hard. It's actually really easy because those are folks who your energies are already aligned, right? You want to do work for this community. You may not all have the same exact way of going about doing this work and route that you think you should take. However, you do know that you want to see the voices of the community members lifted. You want to see the inequities reduced. You want to see people living and thriving with great quality of life. And so we may not all have the same pathways that we take, but starting with the folks that are trusted by the people most impacted is very helpful. And then ensuring that their decision makers, right, that they know of, understanding the relationship that they have with them and how they're perceived. So if you want to work their decision makers into these conversations and they don't trust them, that's a problem, right? That's a conversation that needs to be had before you can get any real work done, because that will be a continuous barrier to moving work forward. And so understanding these relationships, understanding, how people are showing up to these conversations are very important to beginning the building of a partnership. And then once you're at the table together and you have that understanding and you have that aligned goal, ensuring that you're continuously talking and being in conversation with each other becomes so much easier.
Thank you. Anyone like to add to that?
Sure. Working as a municipality, it's a little bit different. We created a bold goal, we're tasked with obtaining a bold goal of carbon neutrality by 2030. So first, how we got our partners together was, we went through our own networks, other nonprofits who were connected to those folks who, are the most vulnerable in the community, in the city of Ann Arbor. So those folks were like natural, fits, but we took it a step further. we started off with an equity training for anyone that partnered with us, you know, and that was like our grounding because, you know, creating our carbon neutrality plan, our mission statement is equitable, sustainable, and transformative. You know, so going forward, you know, it was really, really important that the partners understood that our work is centered around equity. So how do we keep those partners going? You know, right now we engage them with surveys because the first phase was, you know, how do we, you know, get the program, you know, get promotion for the program? How do we create the plan and all of, you know, those things that we went through for about 82 days. And that's from November last year to about February this year to the COVID happened. So so it was very important that like we kept them going, you know, kept them engaged, even though we're not in the office, we're not physically seeing each other. So we always look for points of collaboration. You know, if there's a project that's coming on, you know, we reach back to our partners. And another thing we do is we keep newsletters going. You know, we say, hey, this is what's happening. We keep partner meetings going. And then another very, very important thing we did was we created a survey because we moved from, you know, like creating a plan to implementing a plan. And as we implemented the plan, we understood that it's going to be some folks who were partners with us in a promotion and creating it, who might not want to go on with us as we implemented the plan. So what we did was, you know, sent out another survey, you know, asking them like, what areas of implementation would you like to be a part of? And that kind of gives us an understanding. Okay, you know, they want to participate in energy electrification, or they want to work on the transportation. So communication is definitely a must, you know, because things will fall off, you know, and I think it's highly, highly important that we don't let things fall off and that we keep everybody enthused and, you know, energized. So that's one of the things that I do. I work hard, you know, to keep folks, you know, energized and, you know, like excited about what's happening and what's to come. So.
Thank you very much. Anyone else have any input on this question about partnerships? Oh, no, yeah.
I'll add a bit. So like for us at Mycelium, I mean, Mycelium, you know, as it's beginning, it's like a pretty small nonprofit, but we are almost entirely staff of color. We're actually all staff of color. Our board of directors, from our leadership on down, is predominantly staff of, board members of generally people that live within the areas that are directed and the areas that like our members are directly impacted in, as well as our advisory board. We also actually have like our staff is predominantly also queer. And so when we think about like what partnership looks like, we go with organizations, being from the community, like we know the organizations that are doing the direct grassroots work. And so for us, it's really important whenever we start any conversation with partnerships to start looking at like what is the leadership structure organization that we're partnering with. How are they actually making sure, even if they're saying, you know, believe in one thing, how are we, you know, around equity or inclusion, then like how is that actually represented with structures, institutional structures of their organization? You know, how are they consistently reaching out to members? How are they ensuring that the people that are most impacted, frontline communities, are at the decision-making table with them? And then from there, you know, it's okay, like if it feels like, you know, we're mission aligned and we're vision aligned and we're action aligned, then, you know, it's a partnership that we really dive into wholeheartedly. Our goal though for organizations isn't necessarily, and partnerships isn't perfection. We don't expect all organizations that we partner with to be like 100% perfect allies. All the struggles that, you know, we're thinking about or going through. Our goal is more like, can we actually have a conversation with organizations, with people that are not just saying they believe in equity and inclusion, but actually making putting decision-making power into the hands of those most impacted. And so for us, like we also see the places in which like we hold privilege, or places in which, you know, there are issues that we need to learn about. And so for us, partnerships are very much also about making sure that we're showing up at the events of the people that are, that we want to be in alliance with. that were actually present, that were showing support, that were building that network with them in order to like share resources. So that's how it works with us, with Mycelium.
I would just add quickly from the consulting perspective, especially in climate planning right now. I mean, equitable engagement is becoming like the buzzword. And I think it's really easy to fall in a trap of, hiring a consultant that talked a good game in a proposal and really doesn't know how to deliver it. And we actually just put out a free resource for folks. You can get it off our website. It's an equitable engagement like RFP checklist. It has some language for what you can put into your RFP, but then it also has a little bit of an evaluation framework. So you can get a sense like, are these people really interested in getting to that equitable engagement, or is it just another way to tick a box for them? And I think that's really, really important. And I'll tell you, like the number one thing is if you're not seeing that they're putting in budget money or have incorporated into the team specific community-based organizations that work with some of your more marginalized communities, that's a red flag. We always deliver that. That's been one of our big things is we reach out exactly as Shameika and Galen have been talking about, as well as Milagro. Like it's about aligning missions. And when we come into a community, I do not expect that the community members there, I'm from Boston. I'm not from that community necessarily, right? They don't have to get to know me. That's not the goal. The goal is to work through organizations that they already have trust with, get the city liaisons to start building those networks. And where we help and come in is help those community-based organizations see how their missions are actually aligned with climate change, addressing it and getting them to understand it's actually a really important thing for them to be thinking about. And that this planning process represents an opportunity for the city to put up, or county, town, to put up some resources to help them build up their capacity to be talking to their constituents and community members about that and start building that local capacity. So I think that's a really important thing for consultants and for those of you that are hiring consultants to be thinking about.
Great, thank you. So Kim, while you're off mute, we always hear questions about how, and increasingly so, how we actually finance equity and justice in adaptation work and what the role of policy actually is. So from your perspective and experience, what are some of the known strategies that you deploy to enable this work? And how can it happen through funding mechanisms or policies or both?
Yeah, funding is always the big question that comes up, right? So for just quick background, I've worked in municipal government. I was an early municipal sustainability director. I worked at a nonprofit, many of you know ICLEI. And then I've been in the private sector since. And so it's always that same question, well, where are we going to get the funds to it? It's really important, but where we get the funds? Listen, if something is really important to the leadership in your organization, whatever it may be, they always find the money to do it. So that's what's really important. Yes, maybe we need to find some seed money. Maybe there's a private foundation. Ford Foundation just put out an announcement this month, $180 million towards their racial justice and civil rights organizations. Those things are great, but I think we also have to be focusing in on how are we making this a top priority? How are we integrating this into our day-to-day thinking and operations? When I was a municipal sustainability director, one of my goals was everybody needs to be incorporating this, right? If I work myself out of a job, that is success because everyone's taking it into account. I think it's the very same thing with how we're approaching our day-to-day operations with equity. And actually one of our clients, San Antonio, Texas, has put together a really cool budget equity tool. I can throw it up into the chat, but essentially it's helping them. It's a set of questions that's guiding the different departments to understand like how their budget requests could benefit or impact communities that are already overburdened. And so it's the kind of things you want to see where they're incorporating into the day-to-day. And again, like I'm not against getting some funding to get that started, but with that funding, you have to make sure that you're focused in on turning this into a top priority leadership.
Yeah. Lil, did you have anything to add on this question about pricing? No. Okay. Are you gonna? Okay, no. All right. Okay. How about Shameika? Okay. Galen. No. Okay. Oh, Galen. Good. Yes.
Yes. At the city of Ann Arbor, we're like actively working on, embedding equity in all of our decision making, especially when it comes to spending dollars that you have choices on. For example, if you look at the map of Ann Arbor, a lot of our lower income areas don't have the tree canopy that our more affluential areas have. As well as they're more prone to flooding and whatnot. So I think and I told our administrator, I said it's really important that if we're going to put equity in all of our decision making for capital improvements and whatnot, that it's not a check box. It has to be an explanation why. Because then as you approve it, you can kind of understand why you went to this area as opposed to another area, and then that kind of helps learning, so it has to be embedded in policy. This can't be something that's a choice, because we've done equity trainings at the city, and you're talking about some tough discussions, and then people just don't change overnight. It has to be a culture shift within that organization or a municipality. And gradually we're doing that this year. So, we're not, God ain't done with us yet, but, we got a lot of work to do, but, we're heading in the right direction as a municipality. So.
For those at the individual level, not at the municipal, not at the, in your organizations, you have the opportunity in different positions to potentially influence where dollars are spent. And so thinking about, who are you contracting? What do they look like? Who are you working with that you are actually spending your dollars with? What are these businesses like? Does your individual organization have a policy about the percentage of minority or women-owned businesses or Latin businesses that they're partnering with? Do they have indigenous businesses local to them that they could actually be resourcing out some contract work in those areas, right? And so it's really also about looking at how we can make individual and organizational changes that may not have the ability to influence something at the municipal level, but can definitely have a great impact economically if you're thinking about maybe some of these larger organizations who have some more money to spend and who spend money on these big contracts and work that needs to be done. And so being creative and prioritizing, right, as was said, prioritizing what you find important and where you want to spend your money, that is how this needs to happen, not just at the municipal level, but also when you're looking at the organizational side as well.
Thank you. Quite so. So before we turn over to Q&A generally, I wanted to ask one final question. So as we all too well know, we're in such a critical moment in the United States and globally. Given the depth of the challenges and perhaps the promise of the opportunities, what would each of you say is the radical thing that needs to happen? And to orient ourselves around that radical way of thinking, like, how do we need to think differently? How do we take what we know, what you're all doing and what we should be doing, and really shift us towards actual radical change? So with that, Lil, if you wanted to kick us off.
Yeah, it's something I think about a lot with Mycelium Youth Network, and it's something that is really, we try to have as embedded within the framework of our organization. And the two ways in which like we really approach this question of like how are we moving towards like radical change that needs to happen is like embedded within the, and our framework really grounds itself in what is now considered a bit radical, but which is just like our ancestral traditions and practices. And that we center, traditional ecological knowledge, that we center, indigenous elder knowledge within our curriculum, that we're looking at like, how do we work in conversation, in relationship with the land, with different ways of being together. This is like our ancestral traditions of knowledge are like one of two core frameworks. And we really believe at Mycelium that we cannot just have a science-based solution to climate change. That I personally like firmly believe if we just have solutions to climate change, A, those are Band-Aid solutions, and B, we will not make it as a society. Like full stop, we will not make it as a society, because the current culture of extraction and just like resource manipulation and destruction, even thinking about nature as a resource versus as a living entity, is destructive. And that we have to fundamentally go back to the traditions and practices of our ancestors, especially of Black and Brown people and their ancestors. And that like we cannot, you know, there's a way that we often talk about people of color in frontline community or working class communities, and it's like as marginalized or as oppressed or as under-resourced. And these are all resource negative or resource deficit ways about communities whose ancestors have been able to work in collaboration and relationship with the natural world for generations upon generations upon generations. And had colony not happened, would still be working in relationship with resource, with like the ecosystem and with the natural world. And so for us, like that's our radical push for what it can look like, and what we need to get back to is like, what are the places that we need to remember? And from that remembering of how we used to operate, especially how Black and Brown communities used to operate, how Native communities used to operate, from like that place, we can actually start visioning out something transformational. So how by remembering history, by remembering the traditions and practices of our ancestors, how that is actually like the base of where we need to start to think about what it means to be visionary and to think about the radical changes that need to happen. And, you know, I was actually just talking to some youth from Youth versus Apocalypse of our conference coming up, Apocalyptic Resilience. And one of the keynote speakers that's going to be there for our conference, Isha Clark, she talks about a lot how youth are so tired of being seen as inspirational during this moment. They hate that. They don't want to be thought of as inspirational and as like this like feel good story. They want adults to meet their demands, which is to have a livable planet. And so I think about that as like a place of like, oh, like, look, we always like go to them, and it's adultist to think that like they're just there for hope for us. Where in reality, what we need to start doing again is reshifting, bringing in the people that are most impacted, not from when you need to check it off on a box, but from the very beginning of the conversation, because that beginning of the conversation is the framework that will hold change. And if that framework is not in and of itself like bound by or bound with the energy, the spirit of like the people most impacted, it's already doomed. And that's the end of my soapbox.
Thank you. That was a powerful one. Thank you so much. Would anyone else like to add to that question?
I don't mind going. You know, I think for me, Jacqui, I think you said it best earlier. It is not being silent. It is that uncle at Thanksgiving that you dread. In my case, it's also my father, who I've had a massive fights with because he is a racist. And, you know, it's, you know, like Lil was saying, like, we're passionate about this work. We're passionate about this being a place that everybody can prosper and enjoy what we have together as humans and as the earth and all the species here. And so it's really hard to not get those conversations to turn into like emotional arguments. And I know for me, especially as a woman, you know, you get emotional about something and now they just discount everything you're saying, right? So I've really been working to confront the people in my life that appear to, you know, when you're like, how am I related to this family? I have that a lot. But rather than being annoyed by it or ignoring them because they're part of the problem, and I really want to understand how they can think that way, how they can act that way. And so it's really important that I try to, you know, approach them the way that will be welcoming and comfortable for them, or I'm just going to end up fighting and it's not going to go anywhere. So that's something that I'm trying to do. And I think, those with privilege need to just not be silent and need to be having these conversations. And you may dread it, but you need to come at it from a perspective of trying to understand. I know it's so hard to change other people's views and perspectives, but I'm sure as heck going to try, because it's just not okay. And I just can't imagine how someone I'm related to could think so drastically opposite of me. I don't know, maybe I just don't understand enough about humans, but it's just not how we were born. It's not how our species is supposed to be with each other and with this planet. And so that's kind of the radical change. And I think if more people weren't silent, if more people were stepping up and having those conversations, whether it's at home, at work, out in the street, in your community, that's, when we really start building more momentum.
Thank you so much. So Galen, Shameika?
Shameika?
Right.
At the City of Ann Arbor, something radical we're doing now is, we're changing, we're getting out of our silos with the community. And I think that's very, very important. And then it's not only just the community, but just going to where the most vulnerable are as our first step, instead of our last or fifth or, later choices. So, one of the things that I'm tasked with doing is making sure that I stay engaged with those who are, most impacted by climate change and have, the least amount of say. Another thing we've done is partner with the NAACP. We did a March for Justice, and that was the first time the city had ever partnered with the NAACP. So it's things like that shows, it's more than just your words, it's your actions behind those words. And right now we're creating a 820 ambassadors course, which is 9 weeks. And, we're going to have a 15-member cohort that will be trained, in sustainability, in different topics. And the first topic that they'll get is equity, the equity training. And then those would be folks that can go out and be peer-to-peer, do peer-to-peer engagement, in their own network. So that's something that we're changing. We're trying to get out of the box of just doing what we did before. So I think that's very important as a city, especially one that's the richest in the state of Michigan.
Wow. Thank you.
I mean, everybody just said so many amazing things. I will honor that this space right now in this panel is part of what radical change looks like. People coming from across the country, from across time zones, from across different backgrounds and experiences, right? And speaking together and understanding that we are where we are now, but we won't get any further if we don't work together to get there and empower the people who we may say are marginalized, but the people who have been the most impacted, right, by some of these disproportionate issues. One of the things, Jacqui, that I was, inspired by you and the work that your team had worked with communities to do, and I'm going to drop this in the chat, is really lifting up the voices of community members. Your community members are the ones who know these areas the best. We live in a time and in a society that is complex, right? We need to be thinking across systems. We need to be understanding how we can be pulling in healthcare professionals, education professionals, youth who are tired of us depending on them for hope and inspiration, because it's not fair, because it's problems we've known about for way too long to still be talking and discussing and debating, because it's not a debate, right? And so understanding that adaptation is just one field, it's just one sector. There are so many things in it, but there are also other sectors and other places where we need to be aligning and having our partnerships come together, because we won't solve it by ourselves. We're not creating problems by ourselves. We will not solve problems by ourselves. And so it's going to take us to really work across these systems to create that true radical change, and looking at toolkits and information and resources that aren't typical resources. I have found some of the best community organizing work that resources that I have used to come from the education community, because who more needs to get the youth and their parents and other parts of the community together than teachers and educators? And they've been working on it for decades. And so stepping outside of just the conversations we have with each other and talking to people in other sectors and understanding how they do their work to create larger systems change is going to be integral to us really seeing impact and success. And quite frankly, in a short amount of time, because we don't have forever to make these changes. We really don't.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So we are going to take some questions from the participants here.
We do have a question from Sean. Sean, go ahead.
Hi, do you hear me?
Yes, but it's a little faint.
Okay.
Go for it.
Okay, I'll just go for it. Thanks for that wonderful talk. I was trying to figure out a way to articulate my question better in my head, but I'm not sure that I quite got there. You touched on this a little bit, a few of you, but you know, I sit mainly in a federal context, and there, of course, has been a lot of bad news there, but I think what is less visible is that there actually has been a lot of momentum that's generated a lot of interest in individuals to actually do something. All the same, I'm very worried that that spiked in the summer and the declining, and you know, I'm worried especially that like the engagement of white people wanes over time and just like doesn't stay consistent. But I want to like make this moment count, and I want to keep on doing something that's actually beneficial. So I'm wondering if any of you have any advice on how to sort of keep momentum within an organization, how to remind people in our professional sphere that this is actually the central part of the work. This is not something new that's popped up. This is not something that's secondary. And how also do we like challenge ourselves to, what are some ways that we can challenge ourselves to stay like humble enough to keep learning, because we need that like arc of growth, rather than, you know, it's also very tempting to be like, okay, we did something, that's a huge victory, let's now feel great about it and then not do anything. You know, we need to actually like be critical and keep growing. So I, you know, particularly appreciate the equity of the toolkit, like ways of evaluation, but like, what are some other ideas there?
Thank you so much. That was a rich question, to say the least. Does anyone want to kick off a response to Sean's question? It was a juicy one. Anyone at all?
I just want to make sure I heard the question right. So are you just asking about like how to make it real? You know, it's planning and then implementing. And you said something about the federal level. So I was trying to make that connection. I kind of missed that. I apologize.
I'm mainly in the federal context, so it's a bit different in that, you know, they're afraid of the word justice for some reason, and I've personally experienced trying to work around that, but you know, I feel like it's a little bit further behind. But what I feel is important is growth. So my question really is like, how do you have any advice for maintaining a growth pattern and actually both growing as individuals and organizations?
I mean, I would just say I can certainly share my experience, 20 years talking about climate change. You know, people didn't used to want to talk about that either. And in fact, I don't think the federal government can talk about that right now either. So we're on the same page for that. You know, I think a lot of it is working first in the system that you have to work with. And so, fine, you don't want to call it justice, then we'll find something else to call it. I've always said, I don't really care what you call it, as long as you do it. And I think Galen had mentioned that, like, actions speak far louder than words. And so being able to really focus in on, okay, well, we can't call it this, but we're going to call it, you know, I don't know if equity is allowed, or inclusion, or nothing. It's just how we do things, but we're going to do it right. You know, I guess that would be my 2 cents, is really just the actions always speak louder than the words. And so any way that you can incorporate equity, justice, inclusion, diversity into the work that you're doing. I, of course, am I've always been the type to ask for forgiveness and not permission for things. So that is probably why I own my own business now. But I think that, pushing the envelope, and as long as things are working and you're seeing successes, in my experience, things can keep going. It's when you get in trouble that becomes a problem. But, it's really understanding your environment and figuring out how to work within it. I certainly had to do that quite a bit because, working in the early 2000s on climate change, I worked all over the country. But even here in the Northeast, we were one of the first cities to be taking action, and then moving into the South and Southeast. I mean, we never talked about climate change or global warming. It was air quality, it was public health, it were other things. So I think finding priorities that are similar and using that in your communication, but just keep pushing it forward under whatever communication they'll accept at the time, and just wait for. That's what I would say. I don't know if my panelists would agree, but that's what I've done in the past.
Sean, I want to piggyback on what Kim said. Also, it's good to, do internal outreach. Find those within your department who think like you, or another department, and start building those internal coalitions. And that kind of helps. The squeaky wheel gets the grease. If multiple people are saying it from multiple different areas and positions. So that's what I will say to you, definitely, as a start.
Yeah, I totally agree with both what Galen and Kim said, particularly what Galen just said. You will not always be in a position, potentially, right, where you have these barriers and restrictions, but you will be someone who is passionate about this work and you want to figure out how to make it go through. And so finding people internally to help support you and raise this and lift this work will not only be something integral for moving this forward in the future, it will be integral for your own individual spirit, right? You will feel tired of trying to push something if you are doing it by yourself, right? I'm sure you have people internally. I know for a fact there are people at the federal level who have not stopped, right, doing this work. They just name it differently. They tuck it somewhere else. They make it an action and not a conversation. And so you can be creative and strategic, but definitely finding people who are also internally in the positions that you are trying to be strategic and creative will help you push this forward, both within the spaces that you are in, but also with just helping you keep, your hope and your work going forward in this attempt to make your work more just, equitable, diverse, and inclusive.
Thank you.
Jacqui, would you like to take a question from Phoebe?
Sure. I was also going to say I saw one in the chat from earlier on.
Yep.
Okay.
That's Phoebe was good 15 minutes ago almost. So
okay.
I'll try to stay on top of it for you, Jacqui. So you
no, that wasn't a critique. I was just. Anyway, go ahead.
You guys are so organized. I'm incredibly impressed. But my question had to do with how we manage to balance all of these psychological, societal, cultural hurdles that we are seeing around us, and policy hurdles currently as well. But, having worked in government much of my life, but for other people's governments mainly in Southern Africa, on climate risk and biodiversity risk for over 20 years, I've come to the conclusion that we are all, forgive my French, kind of pissing into the wind if we can't substantiate this by changing the goals of our economy explicitly. Now, we've got a fantastic opportunity now with the pandemic and resilient economic recovery. We've got to get it in there too, because otherwise, people will give lip service, but when it comes to planning and financing and, our market-based growth model, we've got to rein it in. And I don't see any way around that. Just to interject that. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone want to respond? Or
I am not an economist. You can go, Lil, if you want. Please feel free.
Yeah, go first.
I was just going to say, I am not an economist, but just to generally answer the question, no, I do not think these things can happen without changing these goals or some kind of overall restructuring of what we consider, success or wealth, or what, these extractive industries are doing in communities, where they're sited. All of this is tied to, again, that colonial settler history, that, getting away from our ancestral knowledge, getting away from the ecological knowledge that we know, and becoming more and more dependent on systems that take us further away from that. And so I do not think we can decouple these conversations from a conversation around economy, because so much of that extractive economy has disenfranchised these same communities that we're talking about raising equity for, right? And so it has to be shifted, but it can't be gotten rid of until there is some way that we achieve equity, right? And so there are conversations of, people need to, do X, Y, and Z in terms of mitigating, but that doesn't look the same across all geographies. It doesn't look the same across all communities. And so figuring that piece of the economy out will absolutely be necessary to moving this work forward. And I think that's why we try to have part of this conversation touch just a little bit on equitable financing and other resources and toolkits, because you hit it right on the head, Phoebe. There's no way this work can move forward without at least some type of shift or rethinking of our economic systems.
Thanks, Shameika.
I definitely also agree. And I think it's one of the things that I think about in relationship to it is that it needs to be obviously a multi-pronged effort. And so how do you think global and act local? And what does it mean to start creating the solutions that we actually want to see, so that people have an idea of what it can look like to be able to even replace or to restructure something? And a really good friend of mine wrote an article called "It's easier to imagine the zombie apocalypse than the end of capitalism." And it was so spot on in terms of what is present for people. I know that it's almost impossible for me to, and I do a ton of work at so many different levels, so many different communities, to imagine our society without capitalism. And yet it obviously existed pre, pre-colon, just before. And so what can it look like now? And one of the things that I think about a lot with mycelium is okay, so if we need to do this, then how do we support organizations that are actually trying to push those conversations at a state level, at a national level? And then what does it mean to then also support organizations at a very, very, very local level that are doing that work? Whether that is radical mutual aid, which I've also seen come out of COVID and the fires here. And I am also very personally inspired by how people are coming together, because I think that people, at least I'll speak to youth. So the youth that I talk to know that this is not working. They fundamentally know that it's not working. They fundamentally know that they want something different. And so instead of saying let's wait to be able to build that or to push the right lawmakers, which is very, very important work, mycelium takes the route of let's just build something else that feels like it can be something that can be visionary and that can be different, so that people can start thinking about it in terms of what does it mean to create a regenerative economy? What does it mean to create an economy that is in relationship and in conversation to land and to our plant relatives and our animal relatives? And let's build that up with youth, because they know that this is not working, and they know that this is falling apart. And they're also less invested in this working because they don't have 6-figure jobs, or they're not planning on going to college, whatever it is. They're we know that that's not working, and to be able to work with them and with their creativity and their innovation to be able to think differently at a really, really local level is part of the work that we do. So we're think global, act local.
Thank you.
Do you have a question from Renee, Jacqui?
Okay, thank you.
Hi there, everyone. I'm really enjoying the conversation today. My question is kind of a segue to the conversation we've been having is economies are often regional in nature, not just local, but very regional. And also climate also impacts regions, at not only just communities, specific communities, but regions in their entirety. So how can we inspire a regional culture shift towards equity regarding climate adaptation and develop tools for more equitable society overall. And maybe, the adaptation field can play a big role in doing this, kind of opening up that regional conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Recognizing that we only have 2 minutes left, is there someone who can succinctly give some thoughts to Renee's question?
I would like to say regionalism. So many times municipalities get caught up in just taking care of their own, that they sometimes forget about those others, those other struggling communities who might, just like for us, for example, we have a sustainability office, but there's other offices, like cities within our county who don't have sustainability office. Mm-hmm. So how do they address climate change? How do they, help their own residents? And the only way I can see through that is partnerships, villages, pots of money where everybody, comes to the table and has a say. So, and someone has to be a leader. It always needs to be a good drum major.
Thank you.
I will add that our climate issues span across regions. One of the things that I just recently completed with a team of 2 other students at Antioch this past spring was a collaborative service initiative for the Conservation Law Foundation. And we looked at in-state migration in Vermont and thinking about where are climate migrants going to be going? Where are people who are affected by climate change going to be moving to? This is not a just local problem. When wildfires happen, where do people go? They're going to other states. They are not staying where we think they're going to stay, right? And so when you're thinking about impacts and planning and comprehensive and municipal leadership planning and development and thinking into the future, you also need to consider demography and the fact that populations move, right? Nature moves, and we are going to need to be considering things beyond just our individual regions, but definitely beginning with, joining communities of practice that already exist, creating or being a part of regional partnerships that already exist to start facilitating and fostering those conversations will be very helpful, especially because those partnerships probably agree because the folks there recognize where the intersections are and maybe just need a couple of more things to be added to their plate. Like, hey, you're looking at the intersection of water here. Have you thought of how X, Y, and Z may play into that? And so it may be an opportunity to start bringing other partners into those conversations that may be able to move those regional types of planning efforts forward.
Thank you. So it is, we're 1 minute over. I think that's a great note to end on and pass it back to Beth. And thank you all. This was a very rich conversation. I was honored to facilitate it. Back to you, Beth.
Thank you all so much. Jacqui, Shameika, Milagro, Galen, Kim. I love having you be part of the network, and I love that you're willing to be here today and share your experiences and your knowledge, and just what this looks like to move these values into action. I hope that you'll be here through the rest of the afternoon today. And as we think about our session tomorrow, our anchoring session tomorrow is about shaping our shared future. And we knew we needed to begin and continue with this conversation about where is justice, where is equity, where is our shared liberation if we're going to talk about our shared future. But I hope you'll be there tomorrow for that conversation so that we can bring this forward and just keep thinking about where we go from here and how we do it together.